The wind howled outside my small house in Silverton, Colorado, rattling the windows as I stood in the kitchen, cradling a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. It was late November, the kind of gray, biting day that made you ache for the warmth of family, and I'd been counting the weeks until our annual winter retreat at the cabin. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence, and I smiled when I saw the name. Eleanor Bradley, my mother. At 92, she still had a knack for keeping us all on our toes. I answered, expecting her usual chatter about packing lists or the roast she'd planned for the trip. "Margaret, honey," she began, her voice lighter than usual. "I hate to do this, but we need to talk about the cabin getaway this year." My heart lifted for a moment. Despite the years of quiet tension between us, I still cherished those family traditions, the ones I'd clung to since I was a girl, back when the cabin was my refuge from the world. My kids, Sarah and Ben, loved it too, even now as adults. At 40 and 38, they still spoke of those snowy weekends with their grandparents like they were sacred memories. "Of course, Mom," I said, already picturing the pine-scented air, the crackling fire, the kids' laughter echoing through the mountains. "What's the plan?" There was a pause, just long enough to send a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "we're calling it off this year. There's a big snowstorm coming up the pass, and Harold and I just don't think it's safe. You know how those roads get." I frowned, glancing out the window. The sky was heavy, sure, but the forecast I'd checked that morning only predicted a light dusting, nothing to close Highway 550. Still, I trusted her. At 68, I'd learned to pick my battles with Eleanor, and if she said it was off, I'd make do. "Oh," I managed, swallowing my disappointment. "That's a shame, but I understand. Safety first, right?" "Right," she said quickly, her tone clipped now. "We'll figure something out another time. Stay warm, okay?" And with that, she hung up. I set the phone down, staring at it as a hollow feeling settled in my chest. The cabin retreat wasn't just a trip. It was our family's heartbeat, a tradition I'd fought to keep alive even after James passed 5 years ago. I'd already told Sarah and Ben we'd be going, and I could picture their faces falling when I broke the news. But what could I do? A storm was a storm. That evening, I curled up by the fireplace with my coffee, trying to shake the unease. The kids had taken it better than I'd expected, Sarah promising to visit with hot cocoa, Ben joking about building a snowman in my backyard instead. I forced a smile, but something nagged at me. Maybe it was the way Eleanor's voice had wavered, or the quick goodbye that wasn't like her. To distract myself, I opened my tablet and scrolled through Facebook, a habit I'd picked up since retiring from nursing. That's when I saw it. A post from my niece, Jenny, Tom's daughter. "Best winter retreat yet at the cabin. So grateful for family time in the Rockies." The photo hit me like a punch to the gut. There they were, Eleanor and Harold, Tom and his wife Sophie, their boys, Ethan and Caleb. Everyone gathered around the cabin's big oak table, smiling in knitted sweaters, a roaring fire in the background. Through the window behind them, I could see the mountains under a clear blue sky. No storm, no snowdrifts, no sign of danger. My breath caught as I zoomed in, my hands trembling. The timestamp read 2 hours ago. They hadn't canceled the trip. They'd gone without me, without Sarah and Ben. I clicked through more photos. Harold carving a ham, Eleanor setting out her famous pecan pie, the boys unwrapping gifts by the hearth. Then I saw the caption on Jenny's next post. "Love how peaceful it is with just the grown-ups and the boys. Ethan and Caleb are such angels." My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. Angels. That's what they thought of Tom's kids. Quiet, refined, perfect. But my Sarah and Ben. Too loud, too messy, too much, I guess. I sat there, the glow of the tablet casting shadows across my face, as the truth sank in. They hadn't canceled for a storm. They'd lied to keep us away. Me and my kids, while Tom's family got the warm welcome. At 68, after a lifetime of stitching this family together, I'd been cast aside like an old quilt, and the sting of it burned deeper than the Colorado cold ever could. The fire in my Silverton living room had dwindled to a few glowing embers by the time I closed my tablet. The image of my family laughing at the cabin still searing my mind. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. At 68, I'd weathered plenty. 40 years as a nurse, losing James to cancer, raising Sarah and Ben through lean times. But this betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd faced. It wasn't just the lie about the storm. It was the realization that my parents, after all these years, still saw me as less than Tom, and my kids as unworthy of their love. I stood and paced the hardwood floor, my slippers scuffing softly in the silence. The hurt wasn't new. I'd felt its shadow before. But I'd always brushed it aside, telling myself I was imagining things. Now, with Jenny's photos staring me in the face, those old memories came rushing back like a flood down the San Juan Mountains. I sank into the armchair James had loved, the one he'd sit in every evening with his coffee and a crossword puzzle, and let the past wash over me. It started small, didn't it? Back when Sarah was 8 and Ben was 6, I'd taken them to the cabin for Harold's 80th birthday. I'd spent days baking a cake, 3 layers of chocolate, his favorite, and hauling it 50 miles up winding roads. When we arrived, Eleanor barely glanced at it before gushing over the store-bought pie Tom's wife, Sophie, had brought. "Oh, Sophie, this is divine," she'd said, while my cake sat untouched on the counter. Later, when Sarah spilled a glass of juice in her excitement, Eleanor snapped, "Can't you control her, Margaret?" But when Tom's boy Ethan knocked over a lamp 5 minutes later, she just chuckled, "Boys will be boys." I'd swallowed it then, like I always did, blaming myself for not keeping things perfect. Then there were the gifts. Every Christmas up at the cabin, I'd watch Sarah and Ben tear into their packages, new scarves or books I'd picked out with care, only to see Eleanor and Harold heap Tom's boys with extras, a shiny bike for Ethan one year, a model train set for Caleb the next. "They've been so good," Harold would say, ruffling their hair, while my kids got a pat on the shoulder and a "nice to see you too." I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that love wasn't measured in presents, but the way Sarah's smile dimmed each time stuck with me. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the sting of tears I hadn't let fall yet. James had seen it too. 5 years ago, before the cancer took him, we'd been sitting right here after a tense Thanksgiving at my parents' house. Another day where Tom's family shone, and mine faded into the background. "Maggie," he'd said, his voice rough but steady, "you've got to stop bending over backwards for them. They don't deserve it." I'd laughed it off, insisting they loved us in their own way. He'd just shaken his head, his gray eyes soft with worry. "You're worth more than their scraps, sweetheart. Don't let them make you forget that." Oh, James, I thought now, staring at the empty spot where he used to sit. You were right, and I didn't listen. The cabin had been my anchor after he passed. A 2-bedroom retreat, nestled 8,000 feet up in the Rockies, where the air smelled of pine, and the world felt still. I'd spent summers there as a kid, fishing with Harold by the creek, and later brought Sarah and Ben to build snowmen and roast marshmallows. After James died, I'd poured my heart into fixing it up. New shingles on the roof, fresh paint on the porch, hoping it'd keep us close as a family. Sarah loved sketching the peaks from the deck. Ben would tromp through the snow, pretending he was a mountain man. They adored their grandparents, even when Eleanor nitpicked their noise, and Harold barely looked up from his newspaper. How could my parents turn their backs on that? A sob caught in my throat as I pictured them now. Sarah, with her quiet strength, and Ben, with his big laugh, unwanted by the very people they'd loved so fiercely. They weren't kids anymore, but they carried those cabin memories like treasures. Last month, Ben had even said, "Can't wait to get up there this winter, Mom. Maybe Grandpa'll tell me his old hunting stories again." And Sarah had nodded. I miss Grandma's pie, even if she tells me to hush every 5 minutes. They didn't deserve this rejection. Not at 40 and 38. Not ever. I pressed a hand to my chest, the ache spreading like frost on a window pane. For years, I'd stitched our family together, nursing Harold through pneumonia, driving 20 miles in blizzards to bring Eleanor groceries, biting my tongue when they praised Tom's every breath. I'd convinced myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that deep down they loved us all the same. But tonight, that illusion shattered. They didn't just favor Tom. They'd erased me and my kids from their perfect picture, and the cold truth of it left me trembling in my own home. 68 years old, and wondering how I'd been so blind. The next morning, the sun broke through the heavy clouds over Silverton, casting a pale light across my kitchen. I stood at the sink, washing the same mug I'd held the night before, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind churned. At 68, I'd spent too many years swallowing my hurt, pasting on a smile for Eleanor and Harold, pretending their favoritism didn't sting. But last night's discovery, those photos of them all cozy at the cabin while I sat here alone, had cracked something open inside me. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was done. The phone rang as I dried my hands, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But no, I dodged enough. I picked it up, keeping my voice steady. "Hello, Mom." "Margaret, sweetheart," she said, her tone syrupy, like she was about to ask me to run an errand. "I was just thinking about you. I know you were disappointed about the cabin, so Harold and I talked it over. We'd love for you to come up for a little dinner tomorrow night. Just the grown-ups. Something quiet." My grip tightened on the phone. There it was again. Just the grown-ups. No mention of Sarah or Ben. Just me, the dutiful daughter they could summon when it suited them. I took a slow breath, picturing the cabin 50 miles up the mountain, the place I'd once thought of as ours. "What about Sarah and Ben?" I asked, keeping my voice even. There was a pause, the kind that told me she'd hoped I wouldn't push. "Well," she said, her cheer faltering, "it's a small gathering, Margaret. You know how lively they can be, and we're just looking for a peaceful evening. Tom and Sophie will be there with Ethan and Caleb, but those boys are so well-mannered. It's different. Different. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. My kids, Sarah with her warm laugh, Ben with his endless energy, weren't good enough. But Tom's boys were. I could hear James's voice in my head, 5 years gone but still sharp. Don't let them make you feel small, Maggie. I straightened my shoulders. No, Mom, I said, my tone firm for the first time in years. If Sarah and Ben aren't welcome, neither am I. A long silence stretched between us. Then Eleanor sighed, sharp and exasperated. Oh, Margaret, don't be so stubborn. It's just one dinner. We'd love to see you. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Love to see me, but not the two people who mattered most. You've made your choice, I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my chest. I'm making mine. Before she could argue, I hung up, the click of the phone louder than the wind outside. I stood there, staring at the snow-dusted peaks through the window, and felt a shift. For decades, I'd been the one they leaned on, driving 20 miles through icy passes to fix their furnace when it sputtered, hauling groceries up their steep driveway when Harold's knees gave out, nursing them both through colds and fevers with broth and blankets. I'd done it all without complaint, thinking it tied us together. But if they could cut Sarah and Ben out of our family's heart, the cabin, then I was done carrying their weight. That afternoon, I called Sarah and Ben. How'd you like to come over this weekend? I asked, forcing a brightness I didn't quite feel yet. No cabin, just us, here at home. We'll make it our own winter retreat. Sarah's voice softened over the line. Mom, are you okay? You sound different. I hesitated, then said, I will be. I just want us together. Ben chimed in. Count me in. I'll bring the hot cider. None of Grandma's lectures required. I chuckled, the sound loosening the knot in my chest. They didn't need to know the whole story yet. Just that I needed them. By Saturday, my little house was alive with them. Sarah arrived with a sketch pad and a tin of cookies she'd baked. Oatmeal raisin, James's favorite. And Ben hauled in a jug of cider and a stack of old board games. We lit the fireplace, the flames dancing across the worn rug, and I watched them tease each other over a game of Scrabble. You can't use zap. That's cheating. Sarah laughed, swatting Ben's arm. It's a word, he protested, grinning. Their voices filled the room, loud and warm, and I thought, this is what family should be, not some quiet, polished dinner where they're judged and found wanting. I'd spent my life bending to Eleanor and Harold's rules, hoping they'd see me, see us, as equal to Tom's clan. But they never would. So I chose differently that day. No more running to their rescue. No more pretending their rejection didn't matter. Sarah and Ben deserved a mother who'd fight for them. And I deserved a family that didn't make me beg for a place at the table. As the snow fell softly outside, I felt the first stirrings of freedom. A quiet resolve that this was my line in the sand, and I wouldn't cross it again. The glow of our makeshift winter retreat lingered in my Silverton home well into Sunday morning. The fireplace crackled as Sarah sketched by the window, her pencil scratching softly against the paper, while Ben sprawled on the couch, flipping through an old photo album from our cabin days. I stood in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee, feeling lighter than I had in years. At 68, I'd finally said no to Eleanor and Harold, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it felt like it was just beginning. But that peace didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the counter, Eleanor's name flashing like a warning sign. I sighed, debating whether to let it ring out. But curiosity, and maybe a flicker of habit, won. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my tone flat, braced for what was coming. "Margaret," she started, her voice tight with that mix of sweetness and irritation she'd perfected over 9 decades. "I've been thinking about our little chat. Harold and I really don't understand why you're making such a fuss over the cabin. We'd still love for you to join us next weekend. Just you, of course. Tom and Sophie will bring the boys, and it'll be a nice, calm evening." Her words dripped with the same old excuse, and I could almost see her pursed lips, waiting for me to cave like I always had. I leaned against the counter, my free hand gripping the edge. "And Sarah and Ben?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing her to say it. A pause lingered, heavy as the snow outside. "Well," she said, her tone sharpening, "we've been over this. They're just so spirited, Margaret. We're too old for all that noise. Ethan and Caleb are different. They're no trouble at all." There it was again. My kids cast aside, Tom's boys lifted up. The unfairness burned in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Then I've been over this too, Mom. If they're not welcome, I'm not coming." She huffed, loud enough to crackle through the line. "You're being ridiculous. It's one dinner. Tom thinks you're blowing this out of proportion, and frankly, so do I. We just want a peaceful time. Why can't you see that?" I almost laughed, the sound bitter in my throat. Peaceful for them, maybe, but not for me. Not when it meant leaving Sarah and Ben behind like they were burdens instead of blessings. "You've made it clear where I stand," I said. "Enjoy your dinner." I hung up before she could guilt me further, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. Sarah glanced over from the window, her brow furrowing. "Everything okay, Mom?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Just fine, sweetheart." But it wasn't. Eleanor's call was only the beginning. By Monday, Tom was on the line, his voice carrying that smug edge I'd hated since we were kids. "Maggie, what's this I hear about you skipping out on Mom and Dad?" he said, skipping any hello. "They're upset you're being so dramatic about the cabin. You know how your kids can be, a little wild. It's not personal." "Not personal?" I snapped, my patience fraying. "You're all up there with your boys, but mine don't get a seat at the table. How's that not personal, Tom?" He sighed, like I was the one exhausting him. "Look, Ethan and Caleb are easy. They sit still. They listen. Sarah and Ben, they're a handful. Mom and Dad are in their 90s, Maggie. Cut them some slack." I clenched my jaw, the 70-year-old golden child preaching at me like I hadn't spent a lifetime cutting them slack. "They're my kids, Tom. If you can't accept them, you don't get me." He grumbled something about me being stubborn and hung up, leaving me fuming. I thought that'd be the end of it. A few sharp words, then silence. But 2 days later, the mail brought a surprise that made my blood run cold. A thick envelope from Eleanor and Harold, stamped with a Silverton postmark. Inside was a legal-looking document, typed up neat as you please, demanding I pay them $50,000 for years of emotional and financial support. They'd listed expenses going back decades. Groceries when I was a teen, gas for family trips, even wear and tear on the cabin from when I'd visited as a kid. At the bottom, a handwritten note from Eleanor. "Margaret, we hate to do this, but your refusal to be reasonable leaves us no choice. We're also considering grandparents' rights for Sarah and Ben. Think about what's best for them." I stared at the paper, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. $50,000? Grandparents' rights. Sarah and Ben were adults, 40 and 38, living their own lives, not kids to be fought over. This wasn't about money or custody. It was a power play, a desperate grab to pull me back in line. I could picture Eleanor at the cabin, sipping tea by the fire, smugly telling Harold how this would teach me a lesson. And Tom, no doubt egging them on, thinking his perfect family deserved everything, while mine got scraps. Ben wandered in from the living room, still here for the weekend, and saw my face. "Mom, what's wrong?" I handed him the letter, my voice tight. "They're suing me, Ben, for raising me, and they're threatening to drag you and Sarah into it." He scanned the page, his jaw dropping. "This is insane. They can't do this." I nodded, the anger rising over the shock. They think they can, but they've picked the wrong fight. That night, I sat by the fire, the letter crumpled on the table. They'd manipulated me for years, calling me dramatic, unreliable, but this was different. This was war. At 68, I'd given them everything: time, care, love, and they'd repaid me with lies and threats. They wanted to keep their perfect image in this little mountain town, but I wasn't their doormat anymore. They'd pushed too far, and I'd make sure they felt the weight of their choices. The crumpled letter from Eleanor and Harold sat on my Silverton kitchen table, like a ticking bomb, its outrageous demand for $50,000 still echoing in my head. I'd barely slept, the sting of their betrayal keeping me awake as the wind howled outside my little house. At 68, I'd faced plenty of storms, literal and otherwise. But this one felt different. It wasn't just their words or the threat of grandparents' rights over my grown kids, Sarah and Ben. It was the dawning realization that they'd been playing me for a fool longer than I'd ever suspected. Ben had gone home Sunday night, but his shock over the letter lingered with me. "They've lost it, Mom," he'd said, shaking his head. "Who does this?" I didn't have an answer then, but as Monday dawned gray and cold, I started looking for one. I pulled out my old filing cabinet, the one James and I had kept in the garage since we moved here 20 years ago, and began digging through papers I hadn't touched in years. Bank statements, tax stubs, anything that might explain why Eleanor and Harold thought they could come after me like this. That's when I found it. A faded statement from our joint checking account, the one James and I had opened back when he was still alive. It was supposed to be ours, our safety net after his diagnosis, but I'd added Eleanor and Harold as authorized users 10 years ago, when Harold's surgery drained their savings. Just temporary, I'd told James, promising to remove them once they were back on their feet. He'd frowned, his tired eyes skeptical. "Be careful, Maggie. They'll lean on you till you break." I'd brushed it off, too busy nursing him and working 12-hour shifts at the hospital to think it through. After he passed, life blurred into survival, raising Sarah and Ben, keeping the house. And I forgot about it. They never reminded me. I flipped through the statements, my hands trembling as the numbers jumped out. Withdrawals, dozens of them. Starting small, $50 here, $100 there. Then growing bolder. A $500 pull for groceries in 2019, when I'd already dropped off 2 bags of food myself. A $1,200 transfer labeled cabin repairs in 2021, though I'd paid a roofer out of my own pocket that year. By the time I reached last month's statement, $300 for miscellaneous. The total hit me like a punch. Over $10,000, siphoned out over a decade, all while I scraped by on my nurse's pension and Social Security. I sank into a chair, the cold seeping through my sweater. $10,000. They'd been dipping into my account. My money. James's money. While smiling at me over coffee, thanking me for the canned goods I'd hauled 20 miles up the mountain in my old pickup. All those times Eleanor called to say their propane bill was overdue, or Harold needed new boots for the snow. I'd helped, thinking it was my duty as their daughter, and they'd kept taking, right under my nose, never once mentioning the account they were draining. The phone rang, snapping me out of my daze. Eleanor again. I answered, my voice icy. "What now, Mom?" "Margaret," she said, her tone clipped. "Your father tried to use our card this morning, at the hardware store, and it was declined. Did you do something?" I froze, then remembered. I'd called the bank yesterday, rattled by their letter, and canceled all authorized users. I hadn't even connected it to this account until now. "You mean my card," I said, the words sharp as the winter air. "The one you've been using for years without asking." A pause stretched out. Then she scoffed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just a little help now and then. You've always done well for yourself. We figured you wouldn't mind." "Wouldn't mind?" My voice shook with fury. $10,000, Mom. That's what you've taken. While you told me my kids weren't good enough for your cabin, you were spending my money like it was yours. She gasped, but I didn't stop. I canceled it because I'm done. You don't get a dime from me ever again. "Margaret, how dare you?" she started, but I hung up, my heart pounding. I stared at the statement spread across the table, a decade of trust shredded in an instant. They hadn't just excluded Sarah and Ben. They'd exploited me, counting on my silence, my loyalty. At 68, I'd given them everything, and they'd repaid me with this. But no more. I'd locked that account tight, and with it, I was locking them out of my life for good. The snow fell thick and steady outside my Silverton home as December deepened, blanketing the Rockies in a quiet I'd once loved sharing with Eleanor and Harold at the cabin. But that was before the lies, the letter demanding $50,000, and the discovery of the $10,000 they'd siphoned from my account. At 68, I'd spent too many years tethered to their expectations, but cutting them off, first from the cabin trip, then from my money, felt like shedding a coat I'd outgrown. I wasn't just protecting Sarah and Ben anymore. I was reclaiming myself. The phone had been silent for days after I'd hung up on Eleanor, her indignant gasp still ringing in my ears. I'd half expected Tom to call next, preaching about family duty, or Harold to grumble about the canceled card, but nothing came. Maybe they thought I'd crack first, come crawling back like I always had after a fight. They didn't know me anymore. Not this Maggie, the one who'd finally had enough. I turned my energy inward, planning a winter retreat right here in my own house. Sarah and Ben deserved a celebration that didn't come with judgment, and I deserved one too. By Friday, my living room was transformed. Sarah arrived with a thermos of hot chocolate and a stack of old Christmas records. Nat King Cole, Bing Crosby, the ones James used to play. Ben hauled in a small pine tree he'd cut from a lot 10 miles down the road, its needles filling the air with a scent that tugged at my heart. "No cabin this year, huh?" he said, grinning as he set it up by the window. "Guess we'll make do with Mom's deluxe lodge." I laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "Deluxe it is," I said, handing him a box of ornaments. Some chipped, some shiny, all ours. We spent the day decorating, the fire crackling as Sarah strung lights, and Ben argued with her over where the star should go. "It's crooked," she teased, nudging him. "You're crooked," he shot back, and their laughter bounced off the walls, warm and unfiltered. I watched them, my chest swelling with a pride Eleanor and Harold could never touch. They weren't too spirited here. They were perfect. That night, we roasted marshmallows over the hearth, the sticky mess coating their fingers as they told stories about James, how he'd once sledded 50 feet down a hill and landed in a snowbank, laughing the whole way. "He'd have loved this," Sarah said softly, her eyes meeting mine. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He would have. The peace held until New Year's Eve, when the doorbell rang, just as I was pulling a tray of cookies from the oven. Sarah and Ben were upstairs, digging out board games, and the house smelled of cinnamon and pine. I wiped my hands on my apron, expecting a neighbor with a holiday hello. But when I opened the door, there they were, Eleanor and Harold, bundled in coats, holding a gaudily wrapped box. Tom and Sophie stood behind them, Ethan and Caleb peeking out like props in their perfect family tableau. "Margaret," Eleanor said, her smile tight and forced. "Happy New Year. We brought something for Sarah and Ben. Thought we'd clear the air." Harold thrust the box forward, his expression smug, as if a gift could erase the past month. I crossed my arms, the cold air seeping in. "What do you want?" "We just want to talk," Tom piped up, his tone patronizing. "This has gone on long enough, Maggie. Let's be a family again." I stared at them, the wind whipping snow around their feet, and felt nothing but exhaustion. They weren't here for peace. They were here because I'd stopped giving. The canceled card, the missed calls, my refusal to budge. It had rattled them, and this was their last play. "No thanks," I said, my voice steady. "You made it clear my kids don't fit your idea of family. You don't get to waltz in now with a gift and act like nothing happened." Eleanor's face hardened. "Don't be selfish, Margaret. Think of Sarah and Ben. They need their grandparents." I smiled, cold and sharp. "They've got me. That's enough." Harold's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." I shook my head. "No, Dad. You did. When you lied, when you took my money, when you chose Tom over us. Take your gift and go." Before they could argue, I shut the door, the latch clicking with a finality that echoed through me. I leaned against it, heart pounding, as their muffled voices faded into the night. Back inside, Sarah peeked down the stairs. Who was that? I untied my apron, smiling faintly. Nobody important. We spent the night laughing over Monopoly, sipping cider, and watching the snow fall. No guilt, no regrets. They'd lost their grip on me, and for the first time in my 68 years, I was free. Free to build a family that didn't demand my soul in return. The new year dawned crisp and quiet over Silverton, the snow outside my window glistening like a fresh start. I sat by the fireplace, a mug of tea warming my hands, the echoes of last night's laughter still lingering in the air. At 68, I'd spent decades chasing Eleanor and Harold's approval, nursing them through sickness, fixing their problems, hoping they'd see me as more than Tom's shadow. But standing up to them on New Year's Eve, shutting the door on their hollow gift and emptier promises, had shifted something deep inside me. I wasn't just free from their grip, I was free from needing them at all. I set the mug down and pulled a worn photo album from the shelf, its leather cover soft under my fingers. Sarah and Ben had left it out after our weekend together, and I flipped to a picture of them at the cabin years ago. Sarah, 10, grinning with a fishing pole. Ben, 8, covered in mud from a tumble down the hill. James stood between them, his arm around my waist, his gray eyes crinkling with a smile. That day, he'd whispered, "You're the heart of this, Maggie. Don't ever forget it." I'd laughed, brushing it off, but now his words settled into me like truth. Eleanor and Harold might never see it, but Sarah and Ben did. And so did I. For years, I'd measured my worth by their yardstick. Every time I drove 20 miles through snow to bring them firewood, every time I stayed silent as they praised Tom's boys over mine, I told myself it was enough to be needed. But needed wasn't loved. Needed was a role I'd played: nurse, errand runner, bank account, while they'd saved their real affection for Tom's family. The cabin, that sacred place I'd poured my heart into, had become their stage to prove it. Ethan and Caleb were welcome. Sarah and Ben were not. And I'd let it happen, convincing myself I could earn a place if I just tried harder. I closed the album, my chest tight but not with sadness, with clarity. At 68, I'd lived more life than most, patched up broken bodies as a nurse, raised 2 kids through grief after James passed, kept this house standing through Colorado winters. I didn't need Eleanor's nod or Harold's grunt of approval to know I was enough. Sarah's quiet strength, Ben's big heart, they were my legacy, not some mountain retreat I'd been locked out of. I'd spent too long begging for scraps when I had a whole table of my own right here. The phone buzzed on the table, Tom's name this time. I let it ring, watching the screen until it went dark. No more lectures about family duty or guilt trips about Mom's tears. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. I didn't owe them my time, my money, or my soul. Not after they'd taken $10,000 from me and tried to sue for $50,000 more. Let them sit up at that cabin, sipping their coffee, pretending they hadn't lost me. I had Sarah calling to check in, Ben dropping by with cider, friends from town who'd started inviting me to card nights since I'd stopped running to Eleanor's every beck and call. That was family, chosen, not forced. Spring came early that year, the snow melting into patches by March. I stepped onto my porch one afternoon, the air sharp with pine and promise, and watched a hawk soar over the peaks. James used to say spring was a second chance, a time to shed the old and grow anew. I'd shed plenty, the weight of their expectations, the shame of never measuring up, the lie that I needed them to feel whole. At 68, I wasn't starting over. I was finishing strong, on my terms. I smiled, the warmth of it spreading through me. Eleanor and Harold might never understand what they'd thrown away, but I didn't need them to. Sarah and Ben were my heart, this house my haven, and every laugh we shared here was worth more than their approval ever could be. I'd found my worth, not in their eyes, but in mine, and that was a victory they couldn't touch. By late spring, the snow had melted from Silverton's streets, leaving the town bathed in a soft green glow that felt like a promise kept. I'd spent months savoring the quiet victory of cutting Eleanor and Harold out of my life. No more calls, no more guilt trips, just the steady rhythm of my days with Sarah and Ben. At 68, I'd found a piece I hadn't known I was missing, but as I watched the seasons turn, a new idea took root. Freedom was mine, yes, but it wasn't enough to simply walk away. I wanted to build something lasting, something they couldn't touch. One Sunday, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the Rockies stretching out before me like an old friend. Sarah and Ben had come over the day before, filling the house with their chatter, Sarah sketching wildflowers, Ben tinkering with my creaky back gate. They'd grown into people I was proud of, not because they fit anyone's mold, but because they were mine. And yet, this house, our little haven through the winter, felt tied to the past, to the years I'd spent tethered to Eleanor's demands. I wanted a fresh start, not just for me, but for them. I'd been saving my nurse's pension quietly, stashing it away since James passed. And with the $10,000 I'd locked away from Eleanor and Harold's reach, I had enough. The next week, I called a realtor and put my Silverton place on the market. It sold fast. $220,000 for the little 2-bedroom I'd called home for 20 years. With the money, I bought a cabin 15 miles up the pass, a modest 1-story with a wide porch and a view of the San Juans that stole my breath. It wasn't the family cabin, that sprawling place Eleanor still reigned over, but something new, something ours. Sarah and Ben came with me the day I signed the papers, their eyes wide as we stepped inside. The air smelled of cedar, the floors creaked underfoot, and the windows let in light that danced across the walls. "Mom, this is perfect," Sarah said, running her hand along the stone fireplace. Ben grinned, peering out at the 5-acre lot. Plenty of room for a fire pit, or a snow fort, if I'm feeling nostalgic. I laughed, picturing James nodding in approval. "It's ours," I said, my voice steady. "No one else gets a say." We spent the summer fixing it up, painting the porch a soft blue, planting wildflowers along the path, hauling in furniture that felt like us, not hand-me-downs from Eleanor's attic. Sarah hung her sketches on the walls. Ben built a bench from scrap wood he'd found in town. Every nail, every brush stroke was a stitch in a new legacy, one that didn't bow to anyone's rules but ours. I'd catch them sometimes, sitting by the fire pit at dusk, talking about their dad or their lives, and I'd feel a quiet pride swell in me. At 68, I wasn't just a mother. I was a maker, crafting a space where they'd always belong. One evening in August, I stood on the porch, the sun dipping below the peaks in a blaze of orange and pink. The cabin hummed behind me, Sarah cooking chili in the kitchen, Ben strumming an old guitar James had left him. I thought about Eleanor and Harold, probably up at their cabin with Tom, sipping coffee and pretending I'd never mattered. They'd lost me, not the other way around, and this place was proof. I didn't need their approval to know my worth. I saw it in Sarah's smile, in Ben's laugh, in the life I'd built from the ashes of their rejection. At 68, I'd learned late what James had tried to teach me. Family isn't blood. It's choice. I'd spent too long chasing people who'd never choose me back, but here, in this cabin, I'd chosen better. Sarah and Ben would carry this forward, not a legacy of guilt or greed, but one of love and strength. As the stars blinked on above the Rockies, I smiled, the weight of my old life gone. I'd reclaimed more than a home. I'd reclaimed myself, and that was a gift worth passing down. At 68, Maggie Harper's journey teaches us that our worth isn't tied to those who overlook us, even if they're family. For years, she poured herself into pleasing her parents, only to find they valued her brother more, until she said, "Enough." As seniors, we've lived long enough to know life's too short for one-sided relationships. Setting boundaries, like Maggie did by refusing to let her children be sidelined, isn't selfish. It's survival. It's okay to walk away from those who take more than they give, whether it's money, time, or peace of mind. And when Maggie built her own cabin, free from her parents' shadow, She showed us that age doesn't dim our power to start anew. We can reclaim our days, crafting legacies of love with the people who truly see us, our kids, friends, or even ourselves. So, if you're over 65, take a lesson from Maggie. Let go of guilt, choose who deserves your heart, and build something beautiful with the years you've got left. True strength lies in knowing you're enough, just as you are.